From the basic structure of the file itself all the way to the various ways we can specify colors, we've covered a lot of foundational information on color schemes in Sublime Text. The one thing we haven't covered so far is how you actually use this information to apply colors, because that's what color schemes are actually for. Now, whether you are modifying an existing color scheme to just tweak a few colors to look the way you want, or you're creating your own masterpiece completely from scratch, in today's video, we're going to cover everything you need to know to create rules in your Sublime Text color scheme. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Odat Nerd here, and welcome to this video on creating rules in your Sublime Text color schemes. Now, we've covered a fair amount of foundational information about color schemes in this video series. It's time to get to the meat and potatoes of this thing and actually create the color rules that apply the styles and the colors to the text, because that's the whole point of having a color scheme in the first place. And we've sort of left it to last here because of all the other information we need to know before we get to this point. And I think that'll make sense as we get into the demonstration portion of the video. Speaking of which, I'd like to apologize in advance because I am a software developer and not a graphic designer. So the examples we have here are not particularly pretty, but they are illustrative of how all of this stuff is working. There's a reason why I create plugins and packages and not color schemes. And speaking of color schemes, there is a link to the official documentation on color schemes and all the information you need for that down in the description of the video for your reference. And keep in mind that also that I am using the package dev package here, as we always do in these videos. So you're going to see perhaps different syntax highlighting and completions happening here in this video that you might not have if you don't have that package. Install package dev if you want these features and other great features, or if you don't have it, things will look a little bit differently. You might have to do a little bit more work manually, but everything we're covering will still work. Lastly, when it comes to rules in color schemes, we rely very heavily on the idea of scopes, scope selectors, and scope matching. And to that end, you often need to investigate what the scopes being applied to a certain particular part of the buffer are, so that you can figure out why your rules aren't matching, or to figure out how those rules actually work in the first place. And to do that, we're going to cover here. You go into the Tools menu, and down here in the Developer section, there's an item here labeled Show Scope Name, and you can see the key binding here on Windows and Linux is Control-Alt-Shift-P. That'll be slightly different on Mac OS. Use this menu item to see that, and when you choose that, it's going to create this little pop-up that tells you the scope that is at the current cursor location. And throughout the video, I'm going to be using that key binding. We're not going to go through the menu, so I wanted to just give you a refresher on how that works. Now, with all of that said, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about scopes and scope selectors, that is very integral to how color schemes work. And we're not going to talk about that here per se, because scopes in Sublime Text apply to a large variety of things and not just to color schemes. But don't panic. Down in the description of this video and above my head in a card, presuming I remember to do it, is a link to a video on the channel that has all the information you need on what scopes are, where they come from, and how they work. And so we're not going to cover that here. If you're unfamiliar with that, or you need to refresh yourself, pause this video, watch that video, then immediately come back to this video and continue watching. Don't forget to come back to this one. So let's go ahead and dive into the topic of this video. The bulk of any color scheme that you are working with is going to be in the rules section as a long list of these rule objects. Each rule object is a JSON object with very specific keys in it that tell Sublime how to know if that rule applies and what to do if it does. And generally speaking, that's applying colors and font styles to text in the buffer. Now, if you're just making modifications to an existing color scheme, then you would be doing something like adding your own rules to your color override file, as we outlined in a previous video, to if there's a style that you would like to apply, if there's some text that doesn't currently have a color scheme rule, you could apply those. And you may also find existing rules and modify their colors or font styles to make them look like you want them to look. If you're creating your own color scheme from scratch, then you're on the hook for coming up with the big whole list of rules in the color scheme. The more rules there are, the more syntax highlighting you get as a result. And again, the link in the description of the video is the scope naming guideline, and a section in the scope naming guideline has the minimum recommended list of scope matching rules to get yourself started with some decent syntax highlighting as a base, and then you can add on to it from there. Now, there will be multiple rules here in the file. Each one of these rules is going to apply certain styles to certain text. And it's important to note that there is an inheritance mechanism in color schemes as well. And the colors that are used come first from the global defaults that are set in the file up at the top there. In this example, that's lines 4 and 5, setting things like the default foreground color and the default background color. Rules can override those things depending on when they apply. And if they don't specify a foreground or background color or font style, then the value that's used is inherited. And it's also possible, due to how scope matching can have more or less specific scopes, that there could be multiple rules that match at the same time. And if that's the case, then they're arranged in the order from the least specific to the most specific, and the colors are inherited in that particular order, starting with the default values that are in the globals, and then moving on through the least specific scope, then the next least specific to the most specific. And this is a very common thing to do, as we're going to see some examples of that in just a second. And for that reason of inheritance, the keys in the rule object are by and large optional. The only one that's not really optional is the scope key, because if you didn't provide it, then the rule can't apply, and what's the point of having the rule in the first place? The first key in the list here is the name key. That is just providing some arbitrary human readable name to this rule so that you know what it's for. And you could put that in there if you wanted to remind yourself what the rule is for. You could also use a comment for the same function if you wanted to. And that is really all we have to say about that. You don't have to put that in there if you don't want to. Sublime's going to ignore it if you do. The next item here is the most important one. That is the scope selector. This is what tells Sublime if this rule matches. And scopes and scope selectors, again, are outside the scope. There's just no way to not make that pun of this particular video, but down in the description of the video, there is a link to a video that talks all about scopes and scope selectors, where they come from, how to write a scope selector, and how that all works. So you use this to target what text that you would like to have this rule apply to. And again, we're going to see examples of all of this, so this will become more clear. The next two values here, foreground and background, simply set the foreground and background colors of the text that applies when this rule is applied. And as we said, there is an inheritance mechanism provided here. So if you don't provide the foreground color is inherited. If you don't provide a background color, the background color is inherited. And that is really all there is to say about that, except to point out that Sublime supports the concept of something called hashed syntax highlighting or semantic syntax highlighting, which allows the foreground color to be, instead of just one color specification, a list of multiple colors. And in that case, you can apply multiple different colors to using the same rule. And we're going to see an example of that in play, because it's easier to see it in action than it is to try to describe what it is that it's doing. This next item in here is the font style. And here in the font style, this is a space-separated string, which can contain bold and italic, or bold and italic. And the order of those doesn't matter. If the font style is specified with an empty string, which it is here, then you're specifically saying no font style, which is what you would put in your rule if you didn't want to inherit the font style from somewhere further up the chain. When the string is empty, there's no font style. There's no bold, there's no italic. It's just the regular font. The next item in here is the selection foreground key. This isn't used super often, but when you have text in Sublime Text and you have selected that text, this controls what color should be used for that text. If you don't specify this value, then there's a global value in the globals key up at the top here that specifies what the selection foreground should actually be. And if that's not specified, then the foreground color is used. So by and large, you don't generally use this value, but you can use it to tweak the color in the selection. And again, we're going to see an example of that, and you'll see exactly what this thing is doing. And the last item to talk about here is the foreground adjust key. Now, this key is only valid when you provide a background color in your rule. And in this case, what you're telling Sublime is you want to apply a certain background color when this rule applies. You haven't specified a foreground color explicitly, so that foreground color is going to be inherited from somewhere else, some other rule or the globals. But with that inherited color, apply the adjustments given in this foreground adjust. And the foreground adjust key is a space-separated list of those color adjustment functions that we covered in last week's video, the second part of the color function. So you can use this to adjust the saturation and lightness and alpha value of the a color and things of that nature. And again, this is something that you might do if you wanted to apply a background color and you wanted to make sure that the text colors that are used are still visible on top of it. By way of demonstration, so that we can see a little bit better how all of these different color scheme aspects work together and how rules apply, we're going to build ourselves up a very minimal color scheme here from first principles. So this color scheme I have here is just an empty color scheme I created using the same mechanism that we saw in a previous video, and the two files on the right, a plain text file and a C file, are set to use this color scheme. And again, we're going to apologize in advance because I am by no means a graphic designer, and this is meant more for explanatory purposes than how you would create something that looks really good. I'm going to leave that part up to you. But we can see on the right we have some colors already applied here. We have a text color of black and a background color of white, and if we were to select some text, we end up with this blue selected text with selection background rather with this dark colored text, and none of that is particularly nice. So we might want to come over here and modify some of the rules in this color scheme. Now, the first thing to note here is that we are seeing colors. We haven't applied any colors yet. And that's because for all of the values that you can apply in this globals section, there are defaults that Sublime will use. So you don't have to specify all of them. It'll come up with something. As we just saw, it may not be a visible something, but it will be a something. So the two things that you can do if you're creating a color scheme from scratch, like we're doing here, is build it up from first principles by noticing things are not looking right and then finding the appropriate thing and adding it, or by going to the list of all the global values which are in the documentation that's linked in the description of this video. See the list of all of the globals you can apply, add all of their values here with a value you think is something that you might want to use, and then adjust later as needed. I'm doing it here by just adding some of them in because that makes the sample shorter. You do that whichever way you think is best. Now, the first thing we want to cover here is the idea of variables and what they can buy for us, because we've talked about this in a few videos, but we haven't really seen any real concrete examples of why this is so powerful, the variables in combination with the color modification function. So we have these two variables, white and dark slate blue, being set to the variables named for and back, with the idea that the foreground color should be white and the background color should be dark slate blue, globally speaking. So we can go ahead and specify the foreground and background color by using those variables. And as soon as we save, we have those colors that are a little bit nicer. But we'll notice over here, the caret is black and the active line is a very white color as well. So, or it's a very light gray, I should say. So this is really incomprehensible. So the next two things we might do is modify the caret color to be the same color as the foreground color, and the line highlight color to be a variation of the background color, but with less lightness. So as soon as we save that, this is immensely more readable. The caret is now white, and we can see the text on that background because that's a little bit nicer. And Now we have decided that we actually don't want the foreground color to be white. We want it to be gray, and we don't want the background to be blue. We want it to be red. If we had hard coded all of these colors, we'd have to do a find and replace, which is more complicated for line highlight, perhaps because we've modified it with that adjustment there, depending on how we specify this color. But also, if we were using the color white in more than just the foreground color and the caret, you have to be real careful with your find and replace, or you might replace too much. Here, all we have to do is change the value of the variables, and over there on the other side of the window, the text color and the caret change to be the gray color, the background is red, and the highlighted line is a darker shade of red. So we have very easily made broad sweeping changes to the color scheme with very little effort. And the other colors we're going to specify here is we might say we want the selection color to be black, because as we saw over here, the color is this blue color, but when we save this, it's going to change. Now, there's actually two sets of settings for selection and selection foreground. There's one for the inactive selection as well. We're not going to worry about that here, but do read that in the documentation if you're interested in it. But here we can see now the selection is black instead of that blue, which might be nicer for us. And the text color that we're seeing here is white, because that's what the default color is. It's being inherited, if you will. If we wanted to, we could specify that selected foreground color should be green. And as we can see, I don't even have to put the focus over there. The selected text became green. So if you wanted all of the selected text to always be the same color, no matter what, you can do that. But you can also leave this, and that color is inherited, if you will, from where it otherwise would have been, which is currently just the default color and nothing else. But this could also be applied to syntax highlighting in a source file as well, in which case you would see the syntax highlighting through the selection. And speaking of which, let's go ahead and jump over to this other file here. This is a C file, which, as we can see, is completely white here because we haven't applied any rules to this yet. All these rules have scopes in them currently, but they don't have anything else. So we're not specifying a foreground color, a background color. We're not specifying anything. It's being inherited. That's part of the inheritance mechanism at play. Now, the first thing we're going to do here is apply a scope to the keyword.control scope. And I am going to change that to the color, foreground color salmon. And we see immediately over there on the right-hand side that the include changes to be salmon, but nothing else does. And only the foreground color has changed because we only specified the foreground color in our rule. The background color was inherited. And we can see here, if we open the scope pop-up, that this scope is keyword.control.import.include.c. So keyword.control is enough specificity to determine that this is what we want to target with our color rule. So we can specify just a foreground color and inherit the background. And similarly, with the string scope, we can specify a background color only, and then we'll inherit the foreground color. So when I do that, we can see the two things that have a string scope applied to them have the background color of Dodger blue, but the foreground color is white. It's being inherited. And just to prove, if we come up here and hit this, then we can see this is string quoted other less than greater than include. And this line over here, when we do the pop-up, is string quoted double. So we are getting both of those things. Now, we might note that when we select this text, we lose all syntax highlighting because we've only specified that the background color is changed and not the foreground color. Now, what we could do, if we set the global selection foreground like we did previously to green, then all of this text would be green. But that's not what we want. We want the include to still be salmon like it is here. So that's not something we can do. But what we can do is add a selection foreground rule specifically to this rule for the string scope to say that the background color should be Dodger blue. And when this text is selected, instead of inheriting the color, use the Dodger blue color instead. And now we can see that at least while these strings are selected, they have syntax highlighting, so we can still see what color they are, and the include stays the same color as it was previously. Now, this can be handy in cases other than this, if the color that you're using just isn't visible against your selection color, you can use this to adjust those specific rules to make that actually more visible. Now, for this next one, we're going to apply a font style instead. And font styles that Sublime supports are normal, which is an empty string, bold, which bolds the text, italic, which italicizes the text, and bold italic, which is the bold and italic specified separated with a string. And the order of those two things doesn't matter. Bold italic and italic bold both do the same thing. Now, what we're going to do here is apply the scope the font style italic to the scope storage. And by doing that, we can see that some stuff over there has changed to be italic, but it's kind of hard to see. So in order to see for sure, we're going to also change the foreground color to be maroon, but a lighter color than what the default maroon would be. And now we can see that the int and the const variables and the char have all had their font color changed to the salmon color and their font style changed to be italics. And again, if we were to come over here, if I do this on int, we can see that is a storage.type, and similarly char is a storage.type, and const is a storage.modifier. But because we have a rule that is just targeting storage, it's applying to all of them. It's the least specific scope we could apply here. Now, what we can do is modify things additionally by saying that anything that matches the scope source.modifier, this rule applies. Now, here we're saying the font style is bold. We're not specifying a foreground color. We're not specifying a background color. Now, what we expect to happen here is that everything that's scoped as storage.modifier, which is the words const here, should inherit the background color because we didn't change that, and it should inherit the foreground color because we didn't change that. But it will change its font style to be bold. And you might expect that the foreground and background color that this inherits would be the default colors that we are specified, the white and the Dodger blue. But we'll see that the color chosen is still the color that we used previously, the maroon color, because storage and storage.modifier are both rules where the scope matches on the text const. But storage.modifier is more specific. It has a higher score. It's applied later. The one that's just storage has a lower score. It's applied first. So that one says use the inherited background, but change the foreground color and change the font style. And then the storage.modifier says change the font style. Everything else is still inherited. If we wanted to, we could also say that we don't want any font style here at all by adding an empty string. And then when we do that, we'll see the consts change back to just regular text. They're not bold and they're not italic, but we're going to leave that there. And for this last thing here, we're going to apply a scope to the meta.block scope. And for our purposes here, that is everything between and including these brace characters. We can see here this scope includes meta.block.c here on this brace. It's also included here on this brace, but not outside it. Inside it, it is. And normally you wouldn't apply a color rule to a metascope because metascopes are more for the purposes of plugins and key bindings to be able to determine the structure of a particular file. Normally you would use other scopes to apply colors, but you're free to do whatever it is you like. And here what we're doing is saying for that scope meta.block, which is all of the brace characters and everything between them, we would like the background color to be whatever the background color is already, but with its lightness bumped down and with its alpha transparency value set to 30%. So more transparent, we see the background color through it. And what we end up with is this. We end up with all of those blocks having this outlined sort of background color, which you could use here in this or maybe in Python if you wanted to be able to see the method bodies being different. And this is also used in the markdown syntax as well for things like code blocks to apply different colors. Now you'll see that we applied a background color, but we didn't apply a foreground color. So as we might expect, the foreground color is inherited from other things. So the const and the char are inheriting the color that was applied by the storage rule, and everything else doesn't have a rule that matches it, so it's being matched by the default text color up at the top instead. What we can do is use this foreground adjust key, and this key can only be used when you have a background key set and not a foreground. And this tells Sublime, still inherit the color, display the color, choose the color as you would normally have chosen it, but apply these specific adjustments. And the adjustments that you can apply here are the same as the ones that you can use in the color mod function. You can specify one or more of them separated by spaces. So here we're using the shorthand for dropping the lightness 15% and dropping the saturation 30%. So anything where the color would have been something, we're adjusting it in that fashion, and we can see the const and the char up in this top item here change their values to be a little bit dimmer as a result. And that's only modifying the foreground color of those particular things. Now, adjusting things like the saturation and lightness of the foreground color doesn't have as much of an effect here. One last thing to talk about here is Sublime's support for something that it refers to as hashed syntax highlighting, and other software refers to as semantic syntax highlighting. And the idea here is, instead of providing a single foreground color for a particular scope rule, we give it a range of colors, a gradient of colors, if you will, and Sublime will choose one of the colors from that gradient and apply that to the text. And the color that it chooses is based on the actual text that it's highlighting. So let's go ahead and jump into an example of that. So here we'll see that if I check the scope of all of these parameters on these functions, they have a scope of variable.parameter.c. They're variables that are parameters to C functions, right? I'm going to jump over here to this file. We have this scope rule for variable, and if we set that to a single color, like yellow, then when I save the file, all the function parameters on the right change to be a yellow color instead. That's nothing new. But what we can actually do is something like this. Now, instead of specifying the color as a single color in a string, like yellow, we're giving it here instead a list of colors. So it has to be in the square brackets, and the list, all the colors have to be separated by commas, as one might expect. And you can use any color specification you want here. I'm just using CSS colors for this. And what this is doing is creating a gradient with these colors as the color stops on the gradient. And if you're a graphic designer, you're probably quite familiar with that. But essentially, in this case, Sublime has a spread of colors that starts at yellow and then blends through smoothly to the color green in the middle, and then further on to the color magenta on the right. That's going to give it a sort of rainbow spread of colors. Within that color, it does a linear interpolation and picks 256 specific colors through that whole range. And once it has done that, it applies them to the text based on the rule, and it does it by hashing the text. And the hash mechanism doesn't really matter for our purposes here. All that matters is the same text always hashes to the same value. The hash value is used to determine which one of those 256 colors are used. And the result of that is when I save this file, all of the function parameters change to have different colors from each other, but the A and the B in both of those functions have the exact same color because they're the same text. The C, D, E, F, X, Y, those are all different colors because they're all different text. Anytime C would apply in the specific scope of a variable parameter, it would have that particular color. So you can imagine that if you use this for something like a string or a function call or a method name or something along those lines, because the method name or the string is always the same, the color applied to it would always be the same, but different methods would have a different color. And you could use that to make it a little bit easier to look at your source code and be able to tell what functions or methods are being called in what places, because all the places where that method exists have the same color, but all the methods are different from each other. We shouldn't end the video without pointing out that there are a couple of error cases that you might come up with in your color scheme. And one of those might be that you break the actual file. Like for example, here, this doesn't have a comma. And when that happens, you get the dreaded error dialog telling you that the file is broken, and it tells you where it's broken and why it thinks it's broken. And there's a video on the channel that helps you diagnose these sorts of problems if you're unfamiliar with them. And when that happens, the color scheme is not loaded at all. So we can see that's back to as if this color scheme didn't exist. And I can fix that by doing that. Now, I'm going to swap this rule back like this so that those variables are yellow again. And we'll see that if I was to change this to something that's not a recognized color, when I save the file, they're no longer yellow over there. I haven't seen an error here, though, anywhere in this thing. And if we were to use the view show console menu item or that associated key binding, you would see an error there in the thing telling you that it was unable to parse a color value yellow at this particular color scheme in this particular location. And we can see a bunch of other errors that occurred while I was doing alternate takes of the video. So the moral of this is if you're working on your color scheme and your rule doesn't seem to be working, check the console to see that you haven't broken anything. And if you're using package dev as I am here, then its syntax highlighting of this color scheme format allows you to better tell when you've made that kind of mistake. As we can see, the bulk of any color scheme is the list of color scheme rules that target the scopes that apply the colors and styles to the text to get things looking the way that you want it to look. And the structures of these rules is very simple and easy to get a hold of. The hardest part of the whole operation, at least if you're me, is coming up with the colors. Now, if you're creating modifications to an existing color scheme to tweak it up the way that you would like, it's a very simple matter to either create your own rule if there's a style that you would like to apply that there isn't already, or look for the existing rule and tweak the colors in that way. And if you're creating your own color scheme from scratch, well, that's just a matter of the time that it takes to slowly build up those globals and the rules that you need. This could be a little bit of an iterative process as you work through getting everything just right. And before long, you will have your color scheme looking exactly the way you want it to look. And remember, down in the description of this video, there's a link to the official documentation, which includes the scope naming guidelines, and a section in that document has the minimum recommended list of scopes. Use that as the basis for your color scheme, and then add on from there. And that's all we have for this video. If you have any questions, comments, requests for clarification, or suggestions for other Sublime Text topics, drop them down in that comment section below this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, so that you don't miss the next video when it launches. And until that next video, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.